The Falcon and the Stag, A Tale of Alamore, by C.J.R. Isely. Narrated by Steve Coleman. Prologue. Age lined the face, pulling the skin around the deep dark eyes as the white-haired man stood at the window. He stared down from his perch at the courtyard below, watching the young man riding his high-stepping black horse. People were observing him from the walls of the courtyard, in awe of the man's ability to move seamlessly with the beautiful animal. "Father?" The old man closed his eyes, breathing in heavily before he turned. A young man had entered, his dark eyes matching those of his father, his dark brown, nearly black hair falling to his shoulders, and his beard neatly groomed. He wore a fine tunic of sapphire, a silver stag on the left part of the chest, set over 3 golden bars, the family crest. The younger man stopped, watching his father with a curious expression. "Father, Athena said I was to meet you here, that you had something to discuss." An underlying tension made his words sharper than he had meant, but he stuck out his jaw in defiance. He wouldn't apologize for his brutality. "Yes, Temrod." The old man's voice cracked with age and hours of silence. "Come, stand with me, won't you?" The younger man, Temrod, hesitated before striding toward his father and looking down into the courtyard. His jaw tightened as he watched the rider below. A hostility had filled the air without warning, crackling from the man like storm clouds heavy with thunder. "He's doing well with the Calcorian horse, isn't he?" the old man asked, chuckling slightly as the animal reared up and stood on 2 legs for a moment, before clattering back to the cobbles. "He can perform tricks enough to gain the admiration of a circus crowd," said Temrod, his knuckles tightening into fists. "If only he showed the same passion for leadership, responsibility, and swords." The older man's face reflected a moment of annoyance, then settled back to age. "There is more to being king than one's ability to kill and conquer, Temrod. If I've learned anything over the years, it's been that." Temrod snorted, turning his back to the window and crossing his arms, watching his father instead. "You say this as though you haven't worked so tirelessly to defend this kingdom and gain her lands. Had you not, we'd have lost this castle to Thornton like we did the eastern border fortress." Laughing, his father shook his head and finally turned to him. "What I did was defend us. I did not live to conquer. If I had, I would not have lived this long." "There are more important things to life than living to an old age," said Temrod dismissively. "Tell me, Temrod," the elderly man rasped, leaning against the stone wall. "Tell me, when I'm gone, what do you intend to do? Paradon is the true heir, my heir. For you, I always hoped for a princess or a title in the lands, such as a duke or lord. But I fear you won't be happy." Temrod smiled, his lips pressed thin and strained. "I find happiness on the battlefield, father. Even if Paradon doesn't care for bloodshed, there will always be a need for men of steel. He'll have me to rely on then. Perhaps I will be the conqueror who takes on the Thornton lands." His eyes broke away from his father's piercing gaze, taking in the room behind them, his father's chambers. He'd lived here for the start of his life, through one door that led from this study. After starting training, he'd moved to the first floor, to the squire's chambers, and later into the knight's tower with the other bachelor knights and warriors. It felt strange to have the reminder of his birth by being back here. "Thornton's princess isn't a woman to be reckoned with," the old man murmured. Temrod snorted again, turning his glower on his father. "You're beginning to sound as daft as those in Kelcor with these crazy notions that a woman might be a worthy adversary. Her armies wouldn't stand a chance against ours, and considering how much unrest tears their country apart with those loyal to our family, it's astounding she's kept rule as long as she has." The old man grimaced, striding toward a seat next to the unlit hearth. "I can only hope you're right. But what I truly hope is that when your brother finds himself on the throne, you can find a way to be at his side and be happy." The eye slid up to his son's again, and Temrod shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. "All this talk of your death, father," he forced a laugh. "You're being delusional once again. Perhaps you haven't had a chance to get enough sleep since Athena's wedding." The old man nodded, closing his eyes. Perhaps. And I do believe there are days your mother and I both are exhausted. A shiver ran down Temrod's back, but he forced a grunt of agreement. Somehow it was impossible to bring his father back to reality. Reminding him that the Queen had died 4 years earlier felt crueler than living in the king's fantasies. Perhaps. He didn't wait for his father to excuse him. The man seemed to be slipping into a stupor. Temrod saw himself out of the study. In the hallway beyond, he leaned against the wall, squeezing his eyes tightly shut and fighting the knot of emotions welling in his throat. He wouldn't cry. He refused to. He had managed to not shed a tear since the day they laid his mother to rest in the crypts. He wasn't going to start now. What he needed right now was to fight, to go into the practice arena and make some knight sorry that he had agreed to train against him. Your Highness. His eyes shot open and he wheeled round. In the shadows a man stood watching him, his bearded face unfamiliar and unremarkable, his lips drawn into a thin frown. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't believe I know you," Temrod said slowly, his hand automatically drifting toward his sword hilt. "No, you don't." The man took a step nearer, his voice a calming purr. "But I know who you are, Prince Temrod." Temrod fought the urge to snort with laughter. Everyone knew who he was. He was a prince. "Perhaps you could introduce yourself then?" "Indeed." The man swept into a low bow, his eyes never breaking away from Temrod's own. It felt as if he could see into Temrod's soul. "My name is Glor Tresfall." The name stirred something in the back of Temrod's mind, and his brow furrowed as he tried to remember what. Glor's lips pulled into a broad smile, and he straightened. "I am the assassin and right hand to Princess Rispa of Thornton." He shifted, moving his cloak to reveal the embroidered emblem on the high right side of his chest, a bronze falcon on a grey backdrop, diving in the centre of a ring of thorns. Temrod's blood ran cold. His fingers tightened on the sword. Before he could think, he had drawn it, bringing the blade between him and the mercenary. "One step toward this chamber and you shall fall dead," he snarled. Glor laughed hoarsely, eyes glittering. "You are a brave boy, aren't you? But I'm not here to kill you, no. I'm here on request of my princess, to negotiate with you." Temrod bared his teeth, bracing himself for the attack he felt sure would happen. "You have the wrong brother." "No." Glor shook his head, taking a step nearer, clearly unconcerned with the sword blade threatening him. "I have the right brother. It's you she's interested in." "I'm not interested in her plotting and plans," snapped the prince. "No?" Glor stopped, the sword point pressing against his chest. Temrod's hands started to shake. He had killed, he had fought, and never had he had someone so indifferent to death, so willing to throw themselves on his sword. It was disconcerting. "Tell me, when King Valren dies, will you still be happy as a prince? Because with Rispa's plan, you could be so much more than just a general to your brother's armies." "Oh, really?" Temrod fought to keep his voice cold and indifferent, but an old hungry beast seemed to be raising its ugly head inside his chest, scenting the air. The chance at more power, more war, more victory. Glor reached up a gloved hand, slowly closing his fingers over the blade. Temrod's stomach turned as the man tightened his grip, and blood oozed between his fingers. Glor's smile broadened. "Yes. Why settle for just a Prince of Alamore, when she can make you the king?" Chapter 1. Grey clouds echoed the man's mood as he lowered himself into the chair to the right of the throne-like seat in the dinner hall. He could feel eyes watching him carefully, waiting to see if he would take the empty seat waiting at the head of the table. He couldn't bring himself to meet their gaze, instead staring unseeingly at his empty plate. The man's black hair fell forward over his equally dark eyes. His hands looked unfamiliar. Pale spiders sprawled on the table before him, escaping the black sleeves of his tunic. "You know, they won't hate you for taking his place." The deep voice made him look up into the kind eyes of a tall teenager with golden blonde hair. He took the seat to the black-haired man's other side, throwing a wistful look at the ornate chair. "He was a fine king, and I know you will be as well." The dark-haired man snorted, shaking his head. "I thank you, Greyhead, but I will never take his place." The younger man nodded slowly. "Perhaps a poor choice of words on my end. We don't expect you to be your father, but we know you are going to make us a great king, Paradon." Paradon squeezed his eyes closed, hoping that the younger man couldn't see how bright they'd become. He wasn't ready for this. "It was strange to be back in the crypts," he murmured, more to himself than the teenager. "I suppose it would be," the deep voice said next to him. "You didn't bury your mother long ago, and now... It's not easy to bury one's parents, I know that." Paradon's eyes opened again, and he grimaced, guilt roiling in his stomach like snakes. "I'm sorry, Cavian, Cavian cut him off with a shake of his head. "Paradon, you're allowed to forget such things. We can only hope our future children don't have to suffer through this until we're old." He elbowed Paradon in the ribs, his eyes glittering with humour. "All the more reason we ought to find ourselves married sooner rather than later." Paradon chuckled. "You are practically married already, Cavian. It astounds me that you and Anara haven't yet announced an engagement. Countess Anara has a certain ring to it." Cavian's face reddened, but Paradon could see the boy wasn't displeased. "I plan to ask her father soon." "How soon? He's a fine lord, Cavian, but he's a lord who's about a 2-week ride away." The red deepened in Cavian's face and was tinged with guilt. I thought he might be coming to my coronation." The smile died on Paradon's face. For a brilliant moment he had forgotten all about reality in giving the newest knight a hard time. Now, however, his eyes drifted back to the empty seat. How could it be that his father sat there 2 nights ago? 2 nights ago, alive and breathing, but dead by morning. Buried this morning. He moaned and placed his head on the table. "I'm not ready for this at all, Cavian. I'm too young to be a king." "You're 26, Cavian said, gripping his shoulder encouragingly. "I became a count on my 18th birthday before I was even a knight. You will be an amazing king, Paradon. You've been an amazing friend. You're just and loyal, and..." His voice faded, but Paradon said nothing. After an agonizing moment of silence, Cavian broke the still again. "Where is Temrod?" Paradon lifted his face, looking along the table where more men, all dressed in black, sat. He turned, taking in the rest of the room, the squire table, the page table, as if his brother might have decided to sit with the children. He'd been staying in the tower since yesterday. He must have gone up there again after the ceremony, after they had carried their father into the crypts. "He's hurting right now too," Cavian said grimly. "My sister was much the same when my father passed. She still hurts when she comes to Lonark. She stays with her husband at his court more often than not, serving as a general's wife. She wanted nothing to do with status after Mum and Father." "Can't say as I blame her," Paradon said darkly. He was watching the door. A man had just strode in, dust-covered and unremarkable. His eyes met with Paradon's and he moved across the hall. "One moment, Cavian." He pushed his chair back from the table. "I think I'm needed." Cavian nodded, watching the man as well. "May I help you?" Paradon asked, approaching the man. The man nodded, glancing around the hall nervously and wringing his bandaged hands. He was truly unremarkable, the type of face that Paradon was certain he had seen but would never remember. "Your Majesty." The man made a clumsy bow, straightening and wringing his hands still more. "The men, they're worried about paying." "I'm sorry, the men?" Paradon asked. He hated how ignorant he sounded. The man nodded. Yes, sire, my men." He saw the blank look on the prince's face and continued. "We've been building a passage that your father asked for, sire. We're supposed to be a way for royals to escape, from what I understood of his wishes. We've been building it now for years, but we didn't get paid yesterday, and when I found out about the king..." Paradon held up a hand, cutting off the man's rambling. "I'll see to it myself that each of your men is paid, and paid extra for this inconvenience. I'm sorry that we have overlooked that at this time. I understand how vital it might be to be paid promptly. What's your name?" Graco, your Majesty." The man bowed again. It seemed to be a nervous twitch. "Well, Graco, give my regards to your men along with my apology. I will speak with my treasurer and council to see to it that this doesn't happen again." The words felt foreign, dreamlike, coming out of Paradon's mouth. His father was dead. His father was dead. "And I will look forward to seeing this passage soon. I expect that it must be grand to have taken several years. My father failed to mention it." His voice faded. How many times had his father tried to tell him about secrets in the castle, of plots and ideas, that he couldn't be bothered to listen to. An escape passage for the royals seemed like such an idea. Something that he didn't care about, that his father would be doing for him. "Thank you." The man bowed again, and Paradon gritted his teeth to bite back an annoyed remark. The grovelling. How had his father ever handled so much grovelling in his own home? He shook it off, waving a hand for Cavian to join him, silently glad that he had something to do other than sit in the sorrow of the dinner hall with the others. He and Cavian would find what had happened with the pay for the masons. Chapter 2. There was no stopping fate, no stopping the days from racing one into the next. Paradon watched the messengers ride out, intent on spreading word of his father's death, and then locked himself within the walls of the castle. He had grown bored with trying to understand his father's records, to figure what exactly he needed to find for the masons. He was certain that without Cavian's steadfast presence, he would lose his mind. His younger friend was always by his side when he needed him. While the rest of the castle skirted around him, staying out of his way, Cavian and he stayed up late in a corner of the Hall of Records, poring over old documents and information. There was so much to learn before becoming a king, so many pieces of policies and laws that he had been certain he knew that now looked brand new, even if the parchment they were written on was yellowed and cracking with age. Cavian insisted on helping Paradon, even sending another messenger to Lonarch to ask that his brother-in-law continue to run the castle until his return. "This is useless," Paradon moaned, resting his head on the table. He wanted to fall asleep right there, on a map of the waterways of Alamore and a chart of the tides in the major port cities. Cavian looked unimpressed. "Pull it together, Paradon. You're being asked to be a king, not killed, so things could be worse." "Kill me?" Paradon asked, lifting his head slightly, a hopeful expression on his face. Cavian raised his eyebrows and shook his head. "And be killed for it? I think not. Just focus for another minute, won't you? Then we can get out for a while, perhaps on a ride or to see this passage that the masons were on about. I'm curious about what it looks like. I've never heard it mentioned in any of the councils. Seems like something your father kept quiet." "He loved his secrets." Paradon straightened, pushing the map away from him. "Let's go have a look now. What do you say?" Cavian cast a woeful look over the chart of numbers he had been examining, then sighed. "Oh, very well." "Excellent." Paradon stood, eager to escape the suffocating smell of old parchment and the sidelong glances thrown their way by studying squires. "Aren't you tired of this place, anyhow? You've been a knight for all of 2 months and you're already back." "I actually enjoy not being ignorant," said Cavian dryly. "I feel that was aimed at me," said Paradon. "Suit yourself," said Cavian. They crossed the room, Paradon making a conscious effort to stand taller. Somehow, being saddled with the title of the firstborn prince, soon to be king, was starting to affect everything about his day and life. It took them some time to find the head mason, as Paradon had no idea where he might find the entrance to the passages. When he did find him, the man was washing his hands in a basin in the courtyard. "Grayso," he called to the man. Spinning, the man sank into a bow, nearly toppling in his alarm. "Your Majesty?" Behind Paradon, Cavian tutted quietly, but the prince ignored his friend. "Your men, how are they coming along with the passage?" Paradon asked, waving his hand lazily for the man to rise. The man did so, wringing his hands once more. With the bandages removed to wash, Paradon could see a thin line of stitching over the palm of one hand. How had he gotten such an injury? "The passages, sire. The passages are near about complete within the walls." He smiled nervously. "What is that supposed to mean?" Cavian demanded, stepping forward to Paradon's side. The prince hesitated, not sure if he should allow his friend to speak now or not. He was going to be the king in a few days. Perhaps he was supposed to show his authority. Grayso looked between them, brows knitting together. "That they're nearly done in the walls?" he asked. Cavian shook his head. "What do you mean, in the walls? Are these passages going to lead beyond the walls? Will they be a detriment to the security of the castle?" "No, of course not. Sorry, who are you?" Grayso asked. "He is one of my most trusted knights, Sir Cavian Greyhead, Count of Lonarch," Paradon said, holding up a hand to stop Cavian. "And I think he's brought up a good point. How are you ensuring that these passages don't compromise the safety of our castle?" They're too small, too short to allow for armies to use them in attack."
The vibration of boots would bring down the walls within if they tried to bring in armoured men,
Grayso said dismissively.
Passages will be good for a few people, a royal family, to escape if they needed.
I think we'd like to see these passages, Cavian said.
Paradon shot him a look that made the young knight's cheeks burn red.
Grayso's brow furrowed still further.
Not much point in the royals having a secret passage if we let others know where they were now, is there? Your Majesty, I would be glad to show you these passages on your own. Your father requested we not tell your knights where they are, and we would like to abide by his final requests.
Cavian's face darkened, but Paradon nodded.
Very well.
Paradon, I don't think...
Cavian, I can make this decision, Paradon snapped.
Cavian recoiled slightly, throwing a mistrusting look at the mason.
Very well.
His tone was still formal, but Paradon could hear the icy cold note that sharpened it now.
I will continue our research, Your Majesty.
Spinning on his heel, Cavian strode away, leaving Paradon's insides writhing with guilt. Was there a way to be king without losing his friends?
So you'd like to see the passages now?
Asked Grayso, clearly oblivious to the tension. Paradon sighed, shaking his head.
No, not right now. If these are the last request of my father, I feel it's only right to have Temrod with me, if not Athena.
Grayso looked uncomfortable, but finally shrugged.
As you wish. I'd be happy to take you and your brother there whenever you decide it is time.
Paradon nodded, only half listening, then turned. He didn't bother with a goodbye, striding back toward the double doors. His brother. He hadn't spoken a word to Temrod since they had laid his father in the ground. His brother had, for days, weeks even, been closed off and silent. Perhaps he had seen their father aging and failing more than Paradon. No matter the reason, it was time to see him. Facing the throne without his brother would be impossible. Chapter 3. In the entry hall, he hesitated, eyeing the lines of doors. He hadn't been to the Knight's Tower in ages, not since he had helped his brother move all of his belongings there, as opposed to the royalty wing after Temrod had been knighted. He had insisted that this was the best place for him to be, high in the tower, where he could be one with the men he hoped to command on the battlefield. Paradon gritted his teeth and finally pushed through the door on the right, into the circular chamber. Someone had hung black drapes over the new Alamore crest tapestry on the wall, and black cords had been woven through the banisters leading up the circular stairwell. The knights in mourning for the king they had loved. His father had been one of the greatest kings in history. He had worked so hard to ensure that Alamore was not only kept safe, but able to retake some of the lands that Thornton had conquered over the generations. He mounted the steps, taking them two at a time, and eyeing the names on each door as he passed. These were mostly the younger knights, those unmarried, or a few who kept rooms here while their wives lived in town. Near the top of the tower, he stopped at the door marked Sir Temrod, Prince of Alamore, and knocked. Moments passed slowly, and he waited, wondering if he should knock again. Maybe Temrod was on a border patrol. Then he heard a thud from within the room, and straightened moments before the door was pulled wide. His brother stood there, eyes clouded with exhaustion, in a grey tunic with bronze stitching. He had tied a black cloth over his left arm, and a black braid of horsehair had been attached to his sword's hilt. He shook himself, rubbing the sleep from his eyes with the back of his right hand.
An unexpected arrival, I dare say.
I've wanted to meet with you, Paradon said quietly. His brother's face held so many more features of their mother, the thin lines, high cheekbones, strong jaw hidden beneath his beard.
Very well. Come in.
Temrod waved his arm to the room, stepping out of the door, and Paradon entered. The room was neat, tidy, but he saw an empty brown bottle stashed beside the pokers, and more black drapes hanging along the walls. The fire was lit, despite the spring warmth, and the shutters closed against the welcoming glow of the sun.
What brings me the honour of my own brother's company?
Temrod asked, striding to a low hutch. He opened it, and Paradon heard the clinking of glass as Temrod rummaged through.
Did you know that our father was commissioning passages built for the royals to escape? Asked Paradon.
Temrod frowned and looked up at him for a moment.
Might have mentioned it some time ago. I don't truly recall for sure.
He raised an eyebrow.
Is that all you came to see me for? Or was there something more?
Paradon shrugged.
I feel we haven't spent time together since our father passed.
No? Temrod asked, bored.
I guess we haven't. Though we haven't spent much in the way of time together since our father gave Athena away at her wedding."
He straightened, a clear bottle of red liquid in one hand and 2 elegant glasses in the other.
"I'm sorry, Temrod."
Paradon's face reddened, and he looked away from his brother, at the fire in the hearth.
"I haven't been trying to avoid you."
"No, I know," Temrod said, pouring the bottle's contents into the 2 glasses.
"I thought for a while that you were, but then it dawned on me."
He reached out with his hand, offering one of the glasses to Paradon, who took it, the strong smell of wine burning his nostrils.
"I've been avoiding you."
Paradon frowned, watching his brother.
"Why have you been avoiding me?"
Temrod dropped into a chair with a heavy sigh, taking a long pull on his wine before his dark eyes narrowed.
"You know our father has been guiding you for years on how to take care of Alamore, how to rule it, right?"
Paradon snorted.
"Of course he has been. I'm the oldest child. It's my duty to take care of this country now, and he knew it was inevitable." "Yes, but you spent so much time with the pieces he taught you that you never listened to the things he didn't teach."
Temrod pulled his gaze from Paradon's, scowling into his glass. This was making no sense. Paradon shook his head.
"What do you mean?" "I mean, before we were born, our father was a warrior, not a politician. He knew that he needed to retake Alamore from Thornton. He understood what it would take to make us the greatest place of power. He lost sight of that, though, when you were born."
Paradon heard the accusation in his brother's tone and stiffened.
"So, are you implying you want to lead my armies into war right after they've lost their king? I don't see that's a very agreeable tactic, Temrod. Our rivals to the east, Thornton, haven't caused issues in some time. Their king is old, their only heir is a girl. Now is a time for us to take care of the country after that many years of war."
Temrod waved his glass-free hand.
"We've spent 26 years in recovery, Paradon. And I'm not saying you should take your armies anywhere. I think that you're better with the leading of policies than the wielding of a weapon." "Then what is it you're implying?" Paradon demanded.
He set aside his untouched wine. For some reason his brother's words were making him uneasy. Temrod pushed himself to his feet, striding to stand before his brother. He had his jaw set, his knuckles white as he gripped the glass. For a moment Paradon was forcibly reminded of their childhood, of the boy Temrod's temper tantrums when Paradon wasn't in the mood to play or practice with him. But this was the man Temrod, and he was eye to eye with Paradon in height now.
"You are not going to be what this country needs, Paradon. You are a politician. But what Alamore needs now is another warrior like our father was." "We don't need blood to stain my crown," Paradon snapped. "I'm not going to order." "You don't need to order anything."
Temrod's voice was rising, excited and furious all at once.
"You don't have to do anything. What I'm saying, Paradon, is that this is not your time. This is not the time for a king like you. This is the time for a warrior to take the throne again. What I'm saying is that you should continue to push for the better of the country, but as my advisor. You're not fit for the throne. You don't care for power and ruling. You know it as well as I do."
His voice dropped and Paradon's hair stood on the back of his neck. He could feel the truth stalking closer to him, wolf-like, from his brother's lips.
"This is the time when we need a warrior on the throne, like me."
Anger, hurt, betrayal. They fought for words as Paradon stood staring open-mouthed at his brother. A choking noise escaped his throat, and he took a step back, shaking his head. It was as if he were meeting a stranger as opposed to his own flesh and blood.
"You can't be serious." "You know I'm serious, and deep down you know I'm right."
Temrod was advancing. He let the glass fall from his hand. The wine sprayed over their boots, the rug, red droplets like blood staining the ground. Temrod seemed not to notice, reaching out.
"I don't want to work against you, brother."
His eyes softened and he froze, staring imploringly into Paradon's eyes.
"I want only what is best for Alamore and for us. You can take care of the kingdom, the country. You can still be with your friends and avoid bloodshed. You would be a king without the weight of the title and the judgment of a country watching you. That would be on me." "Then why not just rule the armies and I would continue as king?" demanded Paradon. "What man would truly take orders from the prince when there is a king?" Temrod scoffed. "You know as well as I that generals go to the king. Even if you said that I was in charge of all the armies of the land, it would never be good enough for the generals. And if, one day, you had a son, then they would go to him, and I, again, would be just a general. Think about it. When that crown touches your head, you will be shackled here. No more riding out to train horses without telling the world where you've gone. No more drinking in the taverns in town or making trouble with the younger knights. Once you are a king, you'll have to become a man, and you'll have to get used to this place forever. There will be no other choices, no stepping away from the people to be free when you are king. Paradon wheeled away from his brother. He felt as though he was suffocating. Before he knew what he was doing, he had yanked open the door and started down the stairs. "Paradon!" His brother's cry behind him rang down the tower, but he ignored it. At the bottom of the stairs, he broke into a run. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he couldn't stay in this tower. The entire castle had changed around him. In the words of his brother, his home had become his prison. Chapter 4. Cavian stood in the doorway, brow furrowed, and a grim look on his face when Paradon woke the next day, early morning light reflecting on his golden hair. "What exactly are you doing?" asked Cavian. Paradon groaned, sitting up, a splitting pain racing along his hairline. Paper fell away from his face, and he blinked, looking around the room. After his discussion with Temrod the night before, his feet had carried him back to the Hall of Records, to the furthest corner, hidden at an almost forgotten table. Someone had left books and parchment scrolls lying unorganized across its surface, and shame rushed into Paradon's stomach, hot and riling, at the sight of the wrinkled and cracking pages he had used as a pillow. "Are you going to explain what is going on? What happened?" Cavian asked, sinking into the chair across from Paradon. He picked up one of the parchments, squinting at the faded ink text. "And what exactly are these?" "Not sure. They were already here." He ran a hand over his face. "I needed to get away from everything. I guess I lost track of time." "You must have," Cavian said, setting aside the parchment and grabbing another, his brow furrowing. "You missed the first night of the Feast of Crowning." The colour washed from Paradon's face, and he clapped his hand to his forehead. "No, I completely forgot that was starting. How many people arrived? Were they furious?" "No, not furious, and thankfully not many yet. Just the Earl of Finwick and an emissary for the Lord of Lonric saying he won't arrive until today." The furrow in his brow deepened, and he glanced up from the parchment. "You weren't reading any of this?" "Was the Earl upset? What did people say?" Paradon asked, ignoring his friend's question. "He was disappointed, but I said you were in the final farewell for the final night of mourning, without any witnesses." Cavian finally set down the parchment, his hand reaching out cautiously for another. "But I promised him you would meet him for breakfast this morning, which means you should probably put on something that you weren't wearing all day yesterday, and—" His eyes flitted up to Paradon's hair, and he shook his head. "Find a comb?" "Not very respectful of your prince," Paradon said jestingly, running his hand over his hair in an attempt to flatten it. "Not very self-respecting of my future king to be asleep in a chair," said Cavian, grinning. Paradon's stomach knotted at Cavian's words. They brought back everything of the day before, the reason he had fled to this hidden place, away from the world. For a wild moment he considered telling the young knight everything, telling him how Temrod had told him to step down, how, until the early hours of the morning, he had truly considered it, considered letting his brother take everything. Even as the thought crossed his mind, it again tempted him. It would be so easy, so much better, to leave it all to Temrod. But no. It was his, Paradon's, responsibility. He wouldn't be the first king in Alamore history to shrug aside the country in order to pursue the life of freedom. He couldn't. Could he? "Is everything okay?" "What? Oh, yes, fine." Paradon shook himself and pushed himself to his feet. Cavian was watching him closely, eyes concerned. "Are you sure?" asked Cavian. He had already picked up another scroll. "Yes," Paradon said, forcing a stronger note into his voice. "But I should be in the dinner hall if I'm to dine with the Earl of Finwick. Will you be joining?" Cavian shook his head, already scanning the parchment before him with a look of confusion. "No, I want to look over these. They seem... It could be nothing. You're sure you weren't reading these?" What's right of blood? How would I know? Me, reading history that smells of dust and mould? Hardly, said Paradon, and he managed a harsh fake laugh, gripping his younger friend's shoulder before spinning and striding out of the Hall of Records. He needed to get away from Cavian, otherwise he would tell him everything, and his knight would think him scared, or worse yet, a weak prince, who was too spoiled with freedom to handle the weight of responsibility. But he couldn't help it, he thought bitterly as he mounted the stairs that led toward his chambers. He couldn't help it that he wasn't the warrior that Temrod was, or had the responsible quiet air of Cavian. It wasn't like him. He had been born to lead a country, had always known this was coming, and now it was here, pressing down, and neither could understand. If Temrod felt this, he was certain he would never ask for the crown. As the heir to Alamore, his father had always led him to lead one day in return, and the time had come. He would have to learn, or he could let his brother. He could slip into the shadows, leave the castle, and never be heard of again. He leaned against the wall of the corridor his feet had carried him to, and inhaled deeply. The smell of warm spring morning air was wafting through the windows, sweetened with the blooms of a flowering tree somewhere outside. The smell was familiar, comforting. His eyes shot open and he turned, taking in his surroundings, heart suddenly thundering in his chest. Even without thought, his feet had carried him to the king's chambers. His chambers now. Not back to his old rooms, where he still kept most of his things. Instead, he was here, in the rooms his father had always lived in, and, years before, his mother. His shoulders relaxed. For reasons he couldn't begin to name, comfort was washing over him. That he had come here felt like a sign. He was ready to be a king. What he felt now was natural. It had to be. A natural fear of the unknown. Forcing his shoulders back, he pushed into the chambers and strode toward the wardrobe. If he was to meet the Earl of Finwick as the soon-to-be king, then he would look the part.
How good of you to join us, Prince.
Paradon felt a jolt as he stepped into the dinner hall, his father's black cloak draped over his shoulders. It was empty but for two men seated at the long knight's table, on either side of the king's chair. The Earl of Finwick, a tall man with black hair and beard, a scar running along one cheek, and heavy grey eyes, stood, holding his arms out as if to embrace him. Across from him, his face twisted with surprise and disgust, Temrod did not rise. "I apologize, Earl Kyver. I overslept," Paradon barked, embracing the man briefly before waving him back to his seat and taking the ornate throne-like chair between the Earl and his brother.
"I see you found a new wardrobe,"
Temrod said, his tone measured. Paradon could hear the undercurrent of anger. He forced a smile, hoping the Earl wouldn't notice his brother's attitude. "A cloak this fine shouldn't be wasted away in a wardrobe for the moths and mice, dear brother." The Earl laughed, a bark-like sound.
"Indeed not. Fine cloaks and fine horses are two things that no man can ever do without, if he's to survive."
"Which is why we're lucky to have your horses," Paradon agreed, reaching for the chalice of water beside his plate and gesturing with his other hand for Kyver to begin serving himself from the platters of eggs, bacon, fresh bread, cheese and fruits.
"We would be luckier, though," Temrod said, throwing Paradon a venomous look, "if we were the only ones you were willing to trade the fine horses with."
Tense silence fell between the three of them, heavy and cold. Paradon bit back the urge to tell his brother to leave, to yell at him. What was he thinking? Finwick was a free stronghold of Alamore land, allowed to trade with whomever they wanted, including Thornton if they so desired. Why now?
"Perhaps,"
Kyver said finally, his lips pressing into a thin smile that did not reach his eyes.
"Your brother will purchase more horses than your father did, and at a better price, so I can continue to make sure that my people are fed, my lands tended, my soldiers paid, and my horsemen kept in warm clothing."
"Perhaps I shall. Or we shall at least need to discuss horses for our coming squires," Paradon said, trying to steer the conversation back to safe ground. His brother and the Earl were glowering with hatred at one another over a platter of steaming eggs. He wondered if the Earl might throw them in Temrod's face. He half hoped he would. Kyver was the first to look away, laughing and running a hand over his beard.
Temrod, you are rather like your father was in his days before being crowned. He, too, thought that he could control Finwick. Paradon, you've got the benefit of your father's later years to you. A cool head and a reasoned tongue. Perhaps you should teach your younger brother some.
I think you've mistaken the weakness my father's age gave him for wisdom, Earl. I feel you will see a strong difference in the running of this country come future.
Temrod's eyes shifted, locking on Paradon's own, and a cold chill ran down the older brother's back.
"Excuse me, Kyver. I need a word with my brother," said Paradon.
He didn't give the Earl a chance to answer, pushing his chair back and jerking his head at his brother, who stood, a brooding expression on his face. Paradon found his hands were trembling, balled into fists at his side, as he led his brother across the empty dinner hall and into the entry hall beyond. It took him a moment to realise that his muscles were jumping not with nerves, but with an innate fury that was rising, high and hot, in his chest. In the entry hall he spun to face Temrod, and his fists clenched tighter. He wanted to punch him for making him look a fool before the Earl, and for making the Earl feel threatened. His hostility wasn't needed, and was unnecessary, even with wanting the crown.
"What do you think you're doing?"
Paradon snarled. Temrod's eyebrows raised, a mildly surprised look crossing his almost bored expression.
"What am I doing? I'm demanding loyalty from a neutral earl in our lands. My lands,"
Paradon snapped. Something flitted through Temrod's eyes, and Paradon took half a step back, certain for a moment that his brother would punch him. But then Temrod smiled grimly, unnaturally. Somehow the smile was worse than the strike, less like Temrod.
"Of course, your lands. So, brother,"
he let the word drip from his lips in a poisonous manner,
"I take it you've made the decision to shackle yourself to the walls and be the voice of reason for this kingdom."
"I'm going to do what our father would have wanted, if that's what you mean," said Paradon. He had to fight to keep himself from shuddering at the look on Temrod's face. "I'm the rightful heir. This kingdom is mine, and I can't step down because my people now need me."
"Bold words for a man who fled like a boy last night at the realization he can't play at Prince anymore,"
Temrod hissed. "Temrod," said Paradon, hating the pleading rising in his voice, "you have to understand."
"What I understand is that you are too scared to do what's right because people may realize the coward you are."
Temrod's voice was rising, and he took a step forward, his finger stabbing hard into Paradon's chest. Paradon took another step back in surprise. When had his brother gotten to be so tall, so menacing? No longer was he the child that had played at war. Now he was the man whose eyes burned with it.
"You had the chance to live the life you've wanted and let this country become the greatest kingdom the world has ever seen."
"Through war?" Paradon straightened, planting his feet. "You were going to tear this country apart in war. Look how you've insulted the Earl before the day's truly begun. Is that what you intended for Alamore? How can a country be great if you burn the bridges and kill the men, women and children with war and famine? How?" He took a step forward, forcing Temrod to give ground this time. Temrod's face was twisted with furious hate.
"Very well."
His voice shook with forced calm.
Very well, very well. You rule this land, Paradon. Rule it until you're bored with the power and something else new and shiny catches your eye. When that time comes, I'll be ready to lead the people as they deserve to be led."
Paradon wasn't given the chance to say anything. Temrod wheeled round and strode away, his cloak swaying with each step. Finally finding his voice, Paradon took a step after his brother. "Temrod, wait!" But Temrod was already pulling open the black double doors and striding into the bright sunshine of the courtyards beyond. Chapter 5. Paradon moved through the formalities of the following days without truly noticing his surroundings. He greeted powerful lords, dukes, counts, earls, ladies, and the kings of allied kingdoms. At the feasts each night, he drank until he was numb, until he could pretend not to notice that his brother was missing from the halls, until he could pretend even that Cavian had joined. For not only had his brother become aloof, leaving rooms as he entered, his best friend and loyal young knight were locked away in his tower whenever not in his nightly duties, still poring over the old documents for some reason. Not that Paradon had tried to get him to talk. Since the fight with his brother he had felt hollow. First he had lost his father, and now his brother. His sister had sent word that she would not arrive until that night, the night he was to finally be crowned king. The thought gave him the energy to at last rise from his bed, stomach writhing with nerves, and dress in a plain tunic and breeches. He would come back and change to something more formal before his coronation, but for now this would do. Until more guests arrived for the final feast tonight, the largest and finest of the celebrations. He needed a distraction. A ride on the horse his father had gifted him before his death would do well. The freedom of galloping through the valley always brought him some comfort. He pulled the hood of his cloak over his head, despite the warmth of the sun, when he slipped from the king's chamber. With the castle growing ever busier with visitors, he wanted more than ever to be ambiguous.
"Your Majesty!"
He squeezed his eyes shut and mouthed a string of silent oaths before turning to the voice. It was the head mason, wringing his hands and looking nervous, sweat beading his forehead. "Hello, Grayso, isn't it?" Paradon silently cursed the alcohol and exhaustion for his poor memory. The man stooped into a low bow. "Yes, Your Majesty." "No need to grovel, Grayso. I am not king until tonight." Paradon smiled, but could feel the expression stop before reaching his eyes. The man straightened, his cheek twitching in an attempt at a grin. "An honour, yes, Your Majesty. It will be great to have such a fine king as you upon the throne." "Are you here because the passage is done, then?" asked Paradon. He didn't want to think of himself on the throne. There would be years of experiencing it after today. Grayso nodded. "Very nearly, Your Majesty. I know you'd want to see them with your brother, sir, and..." A pang shot through Paradon, and he shook his head. "I'm not sure Temrod will be joining us." The man's brow furrowed. "Temrod sent me, Your Majesty. He said he wanted a chance to speak, something about he needed to make amends with his brother before entering this next chapter of history." For the first time in days, a thrill ran through Paradon, his heart jumping. "Really? He said that? Grayso, where did you see him?" "He was already heading down the passage with my second, Wimser. Said he'd be meeting you there, Your Majesty." "Lead the way, then." Paradon waved a hand forward. The man looked taken aback, but turned, shuffling along the hall toward the stairwell. They had just reached it when Cavian, red-faced and panting, appeared. He looked between Grayso and Paradon, wide-eyed. "Cavian?" asked Paradon.
"Paradon, I need a word, and immediately. This is urgent,"
Cavian said, ignoring Paradon's concern.
"Cavian, can't it wait? I was going to speak with my brother," said Paradon.
"Your brother?"
Something washed over Cavian's face. He shook his head frantically.
"I need to speak with you before then."
"His brother's waiting, sir,"
Grayso said pointedly. Cavian threw Grayso an annoyed look.
"His brother can wait, and so can you. I need a word with the High Prince of Alamore."
"Your Majesty, shall I tell your brother that he should try to speak with you later, then?"
asked Grayso, wringing his hands again.
"I think he'll be disappointed, but..."
"That won't be necessary."
Paradon shook his head.
"Cavian, just tell me as I walk."
"Your Majesty, I'm afraid he shouldn't come with us,"
Grayso said, his tone apologetic.
"The passage is meant for royals only."
Cavian threw Grayso a mistrusting look that the older man returned.
"Where are you going? Where's this passage?"
"It's a secret,"
Grayso insisted.
"Look, you common mule,"
Cavian snarled, his face flushing with fury.
"Cavian, that's enough,"
Paradon barked.
Had this whole court gone mad? "Cavian, if you don't wish to tell me now, then you'll have to wait."
"Paradon, I need to talk to you."
Grayso grunted, pushing past Cavian and down the steps. Paradon hesitated before he started to follow.
"Temrod is going to betray you,"
Cavian yelled, and Paradon froze, turning on the step to stare up at his most trusted knight. The young man's face was taut with distress, his eyes overly bright.
"He's going to try to take the throne, Paradon."
The mason had fallen silent behind him on the stairs. The whole world, in fact, had gone silent. It was as if it were only the prince and Cavian, staring at one another, that existed anymore.
"What do you mean?"
Paradon asked slowly.
"You're not safe with him, Paradon."
Cavian's voice had become a plea.
"He's going to try to take your throne. You know he wants the throne, and if he were to challenge you to right of blood, he could take the crown without question. He's going to challenge you to right of blood, a duel to the death before the court, to see who is a better fit for king."
Paradon realized he was shaking his head. He didn't know how long he had been, but Cavian's voice had drifted to silence.
"No,"
Paradon said at last.
"No, he's my brother. You don't understand because you haven't any brother of your own."
"But Paradon..."
"Enough!"
Paradon yelled. Cavian fell silent. The prince had had enough. He couldn't look at the young knight's pained face, so he turned, passing the mason and taking the steps 2 at a time. He would speak to his brother, prove Cavian wrong.
"Your Majesty,"
Grayso was panting as he tried to keep up with the tall man's strides.
"Do you believe he was right?"
"Not for an instant," Paradon said firmly. The nagging doubt in his mind was shoved back again.
"My brother and I having a disagreement does not mean he intends to kill me for power before the court. Even if he wants power, this is the chance for he and I to discuss it. Now, where is this passage?"
"This way." The man took the lead again, and the prince followed, his hood still lowered to hide his face from the visiting dignitaries. They crossed the dinner hall where servants were setting long tables with deep blue cloths and silver cutlery, and passed through a door. Paradon's heart sank, as for a terrible moment he thought they were entering the room where he'd last seen his father's body, the final farewell. But Grayso continued past it and through a different door. It led down a flight of stairs that Paradon didn't know. He slowed, his hand automatically drifting to his sword hilt for comfort as they descended into the dark corridor. Few torches were lit, and despite Grayso's insistence that this passage had been worked on, the air was cool and stale. It felt untouched for some time, perhaps even years.
"Where is it?" "Not much further now. Right about... yes."
Grayso stooped, running his fingers over the flagstone floor. Paradon had to squint in the dim light to make out the small grooves in the stone that the man slipped his fingers under. He lifted, and the large rock moved with surprising ease, opening to reveal a black hole in the floor. Paradon's heart clenched.
"Down there?" "Yes, Your Majesty. Down here."
Grayso reached for the nearest torch, grabbing it before leaping into the dark below. He didn't seem to notice the prince's apprehension.
"It's not a far drop, Your Majesty."
Paradon took an uneasy step forward, heart rattling his ribs with an uneasy rhythm. The man was smiling up from below, his bearded face welcoming. Paradon considered refusing, waiting to speak to Temrod until after the coronation after all, then remembered his brother's look of furious hate. He had caused that. Taking a deep breath, he sat on the floor and lowered himself into the dark. Chapter 6.
"Where is Temrod?"
Paradon demanded as soon as he straightened. The tunnel had surprisingly high ceilings, and like the passage above, a feeling of old neglect.
"How long has this been here?" "This is the first wing we worked on,"
Grayso explained.
"We'll be meeting your brother further in the stable passage. He's there to see what the masons are working on today."
"Then why didn't we go there?" asked Paradon slowly.
"Because,"
Grayso explained, starting ahead, torch aloft.
"I had to show you the escape route. It wouldn't do for the king to not know how to reach the horses in his own tunnel system. This is killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
Paradon furrowed his brow. The man's voice had changed slightly, becoming almost laughing for a moment as opposed to the snivelling and subservient scared tone. He shook himself. He was being ridiculous. Paranoid, even. They moved down the hall in relative silence, only broken when the mason would point out an off-branch and explain that there were other passages under the castle in different directions. A few times Paradon shivered, feeling sure he could hear voices echoing off the walls. Then he would berate himself. There were no voices, no people under the castle.
"I feel like this is centuries of work, not just some design of my father,"
Paradon said at last, breaking his silence.
"Yes, it is,"
Grayso agreed.
"First builders put some passages under the castle for your ancestors."
"To escape?" Paradon furrowed his brow. He hadn't heard of such a thing.
"In a way," Grayso said cryptically. "Now, just around this bend, and yes."
Torches were lit around the corner, lighting the red dirt walls, floors and ceilings of the passage ahead. Someone had strung a ladder reaching from a square in the ceiling to the floor ahead. Paradon stopped, staring at the lines of torches. Someone had taken the time to light all of them. So, where are we?
"Beneath the stable, of course,"
said Grayso. Paradon stepped further forward, past the mason, running his hands over the walls. The whole place felt like a trap, closing him in, making him lose all sense of self and direction. Could they really be beneath the barn? It felt like they had been walking in strange patterns for hours. What time was it? And if they were beneath the barn, where was Temrod? "How long have we been down here?" Paradon asked, finally turning toward the stooped mason. But something had happened. The mason was no longer wringing his hands. He wasn't stooped. He stood, tall and erect, shoulders pulled back and a confident smile breaking the beard.
His cloak had been thrown aside, and Paradon's blood ran cold. The man's clothing seemed to glint with the hilts of weapons, small axes at his belt, daggers along his sides, a sword on his hip. "I'm afraid Temrod had to leave. After all, he has a coronation to attend." The man's voice was different, growling, deep, a note of manic joy in it. He took a step toward Paradon. The limp was gone. He moved cat-like, calmly sliding one hand to the sword. "It's a shame you won't be there when he reads the letter with your seal saying you've left Alamore, that you did not want the crown thrust upon you. It'll be a shame to miss—" He took another step, his words freezing the prince to the floor. "That you will never get to hear him and your sister order search parties to find you. But the crown must rest on someone's head tonight. Athena is a woman. It won't be hers. She doesn't have a child yet to call an heir. But your brother is ready to take the throne, and soon, another step, he will be ready to announce his engagement to my master, the Princess of Thornton." "You're lying," Paradon hissed. His mouth had gone dry. "Lying!" The man laughed maniacally. "Even if I were lying, what chance have you to get away? For a moment there, I feared that meddling Knight ruined everything, ruined all of this." The man laughed coldly. "But you brushed him away like the fool you are. Too trusting of your brother, too willing to forgive. You never would have made a good king, Paradon." "Grayso, don't be a fool," Paradon said, his hand at last, and too late, moving toward his sword. Grayso unsheathed his sword with one hand, and with the other pulled a thin-bladed knife from his jerkin. "I'm not Grayso. I'm no mason. I am Glor Tresfall, assassin of Princess Rispa, and loyal to King Temrod, her betrothed. Don't bother with the blade, Paradon, unless you truly want me to draw this out to make you suffer." His face twisted in a terrible leer. "Which I would love. I've promised your brother it would be quick, but give me a reason and I shall make you wish you'd been born to a pig farm." Paradon hesitated for only a heartbeat before gripping his sword handle and moving to unsheath it. The dagger flew from Glor's hand and he wheeled to the side, though not quickly enough. Pain flashed before him, scarlet and hot, as it dripped down his arm. His hand nearly released his sword to grip his now bleeding shoulder. Glor laughed. "I hoped this was what you chose. I'll have to beg forgiveness from my new king, but I feel he will find it in his heart to forgive the man who put him on the throne." He was panting, a manic gleam in his eyes. Paradon gripped his sword tighter, the fingers of his left hand trembling with the pain spreading down his arm. Panic was starting to rise in his chest with the realization that he was going to die here, in this tunnel, away from help. No one knew where these passages were. No one knew where he was. He took a wavering step back, away from Glor. The assassin, cackling, advanced and drew a second dagger from his body. "Are you going to try to run away, truly?" asked Glor. "Like a coward? Beg for a fast death, and I will grant it. Beg for me to kill you like I poisoned your father, and I shall see to it that your death is quick. You might not even have a chance to scream." The words rang in Paradon's head for a long moment, freezing the beat of life in his chest. His father had been poisoned, and by this man, posing as an aide to the king while truly weakening the castle and collecting payment. He was going to die here, he was certain. He wasn't made for battle, and this man lived to kill. But he would not die a coward. He would not die slinking away in fear, no. "No!" The words ripped from Paradon, and he lunged forward, the assassin's face registering surprise. He recovered quickly, however, and blocked Paradon's strike against his sword, snaking beneath with the dagger to slice at the prince's side. He felt fabric and skin catch and tear, blood crying down his ribs. It didn't matter. If he died, he would make sure he took this man with him. Another strike, and the assassin was laughing again, slipping from his blows in a snake-like dance. "You might be a prince and a decent swordsman, but you're nothing compared to me. You're no natural with a blade." Paradon didn't have time to consider a rebuke, as the man lifted a booted foot and kicked him hard in the chest. Paradon staggered and fell to the earth, the sword flying from his hands. The blade slithered over the red dirt, cutting a trail and coming to rest out of his reach. Paradon made to rise and received another kick to the chest. He fell back, spluttering for air, tasting blood and dust that clogged his throat and lungs. He stared up at the hate-filled eyes above, and a calm clarity rested over him. This was how he was going to die, then. He wouldn't show fear. He wouldn't show anything at all. Instead, he would watch it happen, so his killer would never have the satisfaction of truly winning. "You had the chance to beg, Prince," the assassin snarled, shoving the sword back into his belt and crouching, the dagger in his hand twisting back and forth through the air. "But you thought you should fight. Means I get to have my fun. What first? Your tongue, perhaps, so I might never have to hear you scream?" Paradon refused to answer. There would be no games. The assassin chortled, straightened and staring down at him. "You truly are an arrogant little—"
"You'll treat the King of Alamore with respect."
Paradon's eyes moved past Glor, and fear rose in his chest again. This time it wasn't for his own life. Instead it was for the life of the golden-haired young knight, a sword gripped in both hands, blood running down his hairline, and green eyes flashing.
"If you raise a blade against him," Cavian snarled, "I promise it'll be the last move you ever make."
Chapter 7. Laughter broke from the assassin again, and he turned away from Paradon, turning both knives in his hands and staring hungrily at the young knight. "Oh, I hoped we would have the chance to meet again. It was a shame when I realised it would have to be one of the soldiers who handled you so that I could tend to the prince." Cavian hefted his blade more securely in his hands, jerking his chin up.
"Well, now you have your chance."
"Cavian, no!" Paradon made to move, but the assassin spun at him, raising a dagger to throw into his chest. No sooner had he moved than Cavian struck. He cleared the distance between them in 2 bounds, an angry snarl escaping him. He sounded wolfish, a man made animalistic with pure fury. There wasn't time for the assassin to strike at Paradon. Instead he spun, barely managing to use the small blade to push Cavian's sword aside. The assassin's free hand flew to his side, pulling free a second dagger. He plunged it under Cavian's guard, and Paradon reacted instinctively, kicking out. His boot collided with the back of Glor's knee just as the young knight's sword drove down. Glor staggered back with a gurgling sound, his body convulsing in pain, his hands releasing his fine-bladed knives. They fell in the dust as he sank to his knees, eyes growing dark. Cavian stood over him, his face twisted with anger and disbelief, his sword stained to the hilt with the assassin's blood. He lifted it, ready to strike again should Glor try to stand, but the man had already fallen backwards, blood dripping from his lips, his gaze staring blankly at the ceiling above. "For a first kill," Paradon said, his voice a rasp as he pushed himself upright, his shoulder throbbing. "You outdid yourself. Do you know who that was?" Cavian shook his head, seemingly unable to pull his eyes from the man's dead face.
"All I know is he had to die."
"He should have died years ago. Glor Tressfol, assassin to the Thornton throne and right hand to Princess Rispa," grunted Paradon. He managed to stagger to his feet, wincing and gripping his shoulder tighter. Cavian noticed and spun, his sword falling to the dirt. "You're injured, Paradon." "I'm aware of that," Paradon said, but his lip twitched into a grin. The grin slid away, though, as he stared at the man on the floor. "You were right. This was Temrod's doing, his attempt at my throne."
"No,"
said the knight. Paradon looked up at Cavian, confused. "What do you mean?"
"I mean," said Cavian slowly, "I didn't expect this. What I expected was your brother to challenge you to right of blood at the coronation. I was attacked after you and he vanished, and once I had escaped, came running to find you. I followed you down the tunnels."
Paradon's blood ran cold. The coronation above them, where his brother would be announcing that he had left, and that Temrod was now heir. If they didn't make it there, then Temrod would still be crowned. "Explain while we go," Paradon ordered, stooping to grab his sword and breaking into a run toward the ladder hanging from the ceiling.
"Paradon, you can't go. You're injured and—"
The prince ignored the knight, thrusting his sword into the sheath and taking the rungs of the rope ladder 2 at a time. Above, there was only a crack in the ceiling that the ladder had been thrown down, and he had to twist, his shoulder screaming in pain, to slide the stone above. Instantly, fresh air, glorious fresh air, rushed into his lungs and the tunnel. He pulled himself through and stood, taking in his surroundings.
He was in a storage area of the barn, hay stacked around them to hide the tunnel entrance. A moment later, Cavian was beside him, panting and pulling the ladder through the hole in the floor.
"What were you saying?" demanded Paradon, leading the way into the alley of the barn.
Stable hands stopped and stared as the prince and his knight appeared as if from nowhere, blood-stained and dust-covered.
Right of blood,
Cavian repeated, jogging to catch up with Paradon.
Your brother has the right to challenge you for the throne because your family observes right of blood.
What the Thornton is that?
It's an ancient tradition to stop civil war. Should two royals, be it brothers or cousins, with the royal line, the less worthy can challenge the true heir to a right of blood duel. They fight against one another. No help from others.
And why would I be daft enough to agree to that?
Paradon snarled. They had entered the courtyard. The dusk air was cool over his skin, filling his lungs.
Because,
Cavian grabbed Paradon's arm, pulling him to a stop.
Because the right of blood is only effective if your brother has a following. Think about it. He's led the armies here for years now. He's always fought alongside them. Should you refuse, you'll be seen as a coward, and Temrod's loyal soldiers will join forces with him in an uprising. Your own followers will see you as weak and waver in their loyalties as well.
And should I accept? Demanded Paradon, hot rage rushing through him.
Then your brother will kill you,
said Cavian.
Paradon, send me as your champion against him. You're already injured, and I can fight.
Absolutely not, snapped Paradon. If I am to keep my people loyal, then they will see I'm not afraid of my brother. Now, we're going in there before we waste too much time here and the crown becomes his, despite any right of blood. He didn't wait for Cavian to answer, bursting through the double doors and stalking down the entry hall. Ahead he could hear the clamour of voices, the sound of confusion, and occasional burst of argument. It seemed his brother was already making his move, telling the court that Paradon had been a coward and fled. Straightening, Paradon pushed through the next set of double doors with all of his strength, letting them crash off the walls.
Temrod!
The room fell instantly silent. He could sense Cavian standing at his back, feel the eyes around the room taking in his blood-stained appearance. At the back of the room, where the last set of double doors was thrown wide, revealing the stairs that would lead to the hall of ceremony, stood Temrod. He was standing on the steps like they were a stage. Beside him, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, her face distraught, was his beautiful little sister. It was she who made the first sound, a strangled cry. She made to rush down the steps and toward him, but a soldier appeared from the crowd and blocked her way. Someone else in the crowd let out a roar of fury, and Paradon recognized the angered tone of his sister's husband.
Paradon!
Temrod's face broke into a smug smile.
How nice of you to change your mind and arrive.
He waved a hand toward the soldier blocking Athena, a soldier loyal to the traitorous prince, and the man released the girl. She rushed towards Paradon and flung her arms around him. He embraced her, squeezing his eyes shut, fighting the burning that rushed to them. He wasn't sure he had ever been so happy to see her, to feel someone wrapped in his arms.
"What happened?"
she whispered so no one else could hear.
"You need to stay safe."
Paradon's eyes shot open, fear flooding his stomach. He looked past her at his brother, suddenly terrified that he might use their own sister as another pawn in his play for power. Cavian seemed to read his mind and stepped forward, bowing to Athena.
"Lady Athena, if you please."
He gently pulled her away from Paradon.
"You have nearly missed your own coronation, brother,"
Temrod said, descending the stairs slowly. People cleared away from him, nervously looking between Temrod and Paradon. Paradon snorted, anger making him brazen. "With your assassin holding me up, I was nearly missing my head. Quite unfortunately, you'll owe your queen a new hired sword." Temrod's face twisted for a moment, then he relaxed, smiling.
"You have always had entertaining tales, brother, but a kingdom deserves more than that." "What are you doing, Temrod?" hissed Paradon, stepping nearer. The words were meant only for his little brother, the brother he had loved and grown up beside, but they carried through the room. "I'm doing what is best for this country,"
said Temrod. He was raising his voice, unlike Paradon, bringing everyone's attention to them.
"You would leave this country weak. You would flee if it so pleased you. Alamore deserves better. We deserve the alliance with Thornton that I can bring us. We deserve to take more lands to the north, to the south, Kelcor, Shadowdale, Fursel. We deserve to be the most powerful country to have ever been." He was yelling now, and Paradon took a step away. His brother looked like a stranger, a deranged and power-hungry stranger. "So, my brother, I challenge you to your throne by right of blood." The room broke into mutters, some aghast, others confused. Paradon felt certain that many in the room, like him, had never heard of such a thing. He silently thanked Cavian for his knowledge. He would, if he lived, have to find out how Cavian had learned so much. Now wasn't the time, though. He pulled himself to his full height, fighting the pain in his shoulder, and nodded. "Very well, brother." Paradon let the word fall from his lips, a last attempt to bring back the Temrod he knew. "I accept." The room took a collective step back, leaving a circle free of people, of tables and chairs, of anyone to stand between Temrod and Paradon as both men drew their swords. Paradon swallowed his heart with the tears he knew he could never let show. No matter who won, his world was about to fall apart forever. Chapter 8. It was Temrod who struck first, and Paradon swung up to block it, the vibrations running up his arms and pulling a grunt of pain out from his thin pressed lips. There wasn't time to formulate an attack before Temrod was striking again, this time in a dive forward that Paradon leapt aside from. There was no doubt in his mind that Temrod was the better swordsman. He had always been. Step after step, Paradon retreated. He battled himself even as he fought his brother. There was some part of him screaming not to strike, not to risk his brother's life. He would see sense, surely. One of his steps was too slow, and blood blossomed over his side, fabric tearing and skin breaking. It had only been the flat of the sword, or he would be dead. But it was enough. Enough to tell his instincts to take over. He didn't wait for Temrod to find another opening. He struck back, all his strength driving into Temrod's sword. There was nothing in the world except the scream of steel on steel, the rage pumping life into his blood. No pain, no people. He had no brother. Temrod seemed taken aback with Paradon's recovery at first, then attempted to recover, trying to drive him back. Paradon refused to give ground, instead twisting his sword so the crossbar took the drive of Temrod's blade. His hands were numb with the shock of the blow, but it didn't matter. He didn't have to feel. It was better not to feel. Never had he felt like this in a practice or one of the raids from Thornton. No fight had ever made his mind so blank. He sensed each move before Temrod had time to perform it. The rush of striking was making him giddy, light-headed, nearly careless. One step back and he left the opening, risking his chest exposed. Temrod's eyes brightened and he dived, sword flying for Paradon's heart. Paradon stepped to the left, bringing his sword hilt up and behind his brother. With both hands gripping the handle, he drove the pummel into his brother's back. Temrod staggered, and Paradon struck again, the flat biting into Temrod's shoulders. Temrod sprawled on the ground, his sword hissing over the stone floor. He made to roll toward it and found Paradon's sword inches from his throat. Paradon's heart was thundering in his ears, and he stared into the dark pools of his brother's eyes. Hatred, as he had never felt before, screamed at him to strike, to kill the man on the floor. He had let their father be poisoned. He had turned soldiers against the crown. All of these things. He wasn't Temrod anymore. He was a monster. Fear flashed in the eyes as Paradon gripped his sword in both hands, raising it to strike, and a scream brought the surroundings back to life. The only scream that could make him stop. The broken scream of heartbreak. "Paradon!" He looked up and saw dark eyes, so like his, like Temrod's, overly bright with tears. Cavian was struggling to restrain Athena, while several yards away Kaiva was holding back her desperate husband. She stared at him, face pale, lines of grief starting to track down her face, and went limp in Cavian's arms. Surprised by her change, the knight stumbled, this time struggling to keep her from melting to the floor. "Paradon." This time her voice was a whisper. "Please, Paradon, not our brother. Please." Paradon looked back at Temrod's face and his heart shattered in his chest. There was the boy who would throw stones into the moat, the boy who would make arrows from sticks, and cried in frustration when he fell off his pony. Taking a step back, Paradon threw his sword to the floor, disgusted with himself. "Temrod,"
Paradon said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have 1 hour. 1 hour to collect your horse, your saddle, your bridle, and ride. At the end of that hour, my knights will hunt you." "And what of my men?" Temrod asked, his face sneering as he pulled himself to his feet, panting and refusing to meet Paradon's eyes. "Will they ride with me? Are they granted the hour?" Paradon glanced toward the crowd. His brother's men were evident in their uncomfortable shifting, the way their eyes burned with loathing. "No," he said at last, looking again at his brother. "They aren't granted the hour. Your men, the traitors of this castle who have plotted against my reign since before our father's death, they can live their lives in the work they have done. They and their families are banished to the tunnels." Temrod looked up, horror crossing his features. "The tunnels?" "Yes," Paradon growled. "From there I do not care where they go. Each will be branded a traitor, and should they return to the castle, should they be caught above ground, they shall be executed." The crowd around Paradon shifted. He saw Kyver, now free of Athena's husband, silently order his men to start gathering the traitors together, freeing them of the weapons they carried and herding them into a corner of the room. He couldn't bring himself to see the faces of the soldiers he had condemned, they and their families, but he couldn't let them free, not before the court, not after what they had done. "Very well," Temrod hissed at last. He made to grab his sword, but Cavian shook his head. "Leave the blade, Temrod. It's Alamore's steel and not yours any longer," Cavian warned. Temrod snarled and spun, pushing through the crowd and out the double doors. No one made to follow him. Finally Paradon turned to Athena. Her husband had her gripped tightly in his arms, and she was weeping silently into his shoulder. He didn't disturb them. He would have his time to explain everything to his sister, the assassin, the rite of blood. The rite of blood. He turned to Cavian, waving him forward. "How did you know?" he asked the knight quietly. Cavian grimaced. "The Hall of Records. Rite of blood had been freshly written on one of the documents, but it didn't belong there. I've been studying those papers since, trying to piece together what exactly rite of blood was, and what your brother was planning. If even he was. It wasn't until today, when I was on patrol and a soldier demanded to know my loyalties, that it was confirmed. I didn't want to accuse Temrod without proof, and it was my proof. When I got back, I rushed to you, and I was the fool who nearly died." Paradon laughed coldly. "So, then why do we have a rite of blood?" "Because years ago," Cavian explained as they started toward the Earl, protectively guarding the group of traitors with his green-clad men, "there was a civil war. The war was between those loyal to the first prince and those loyal to his brother. The country was nearly destroyed, and in the end the people stopped fighting and started to rise against both brothers. The army commanders told the brothers they would need to find a way to decide the crowned king without spilling more Alamore blood. So they decided, by right of blood, that they would fight for the crown." "And the older one won?" asked Paradon, grinning. Cavian grimaced again, looking apologetic. "Actually, he died within moments, and turned out he wasn't great with the sword." "Your Majesty, King!" Kyver bowed his head respectfully, and Paradon started at the title. "We should carry your orders out immediately," Kyver intoned in his deep voice. He glanced around and lowered his voice further. "You do not want to start your kingship by showing any more mercy than you have to your brother. Hesitation now should be seen as weakness." The Earl's eyes were full of sympathy, but his face was set. "I'm still Prince, Earl, but very well," sighed Paradon. "We shall brand and banish these men, but before I am crowned, I do not want this evil to be the first act of my kingship." Epilogue. Temrod could see his wife and imagine her expression. Beautiful, brown-haired, her chin lifted in her defiant way, her blue eyes sparkling, standing in the courtyard with the 3 boys below, one hand resting across her abdomen. The boys played with sticks as though they were swords, and she ordered them about like the commanding queen she was. He sighed, running a hand over his hair. Out of habit he lifted his eyes to the west. He could almost imagine that he could see the banner waving, the silver stag, the 3 gold bars, the sapphire backdrop. But it was impossible. Even so, the hate rose at the thought, aged with years, with rants, with battle strategies that he and his wife had devised against his brother's armies. For years they had hoped their eldest would one day be so fortunate as to still inherit Alamore, but then Paradon had wed a girl he had met at another wedding, the wedding of the accursed knight Cavian, now Count of Lonnoc. Paradon had a son now, another child on the way from what the spies had gleaned, the few spies that had slipped from the tunnels, half deranged by their exile, living like animals in the earth. He shuddered at the thought of what he had left his first loyal subjects to face, but again, it had been necessary, a necessary evil. He heard the laughter of the boys below and looked down again, lips pressing thin. He would raise them to know their enemies, to know what was theirs and how they must take it. He would raise them to strike back, and when the time was right, his crown would be passed down. He could imagine his oldest son, a man, a swordsman with blue eyes that flashed dangerously, rising to become King of Alamore and Thornton. He would, some day, rise against a future King of Alamore. He would defeat him, and blood dripping from his sword, at last be the one to combine the two banners, the Falcon and the Stag. The end. Author's note. Thank you for reading The Falcon and the Stag. I could not be more grateful that of all the books on all the shelves, or screens in fact, you decided to read this one. The story of Alamore continues in the William of Alamore series, Book 1, Ranger of Kings. It's available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle edition, or through Kindle Unlimited. If you have the time, I would greatly appreciate you leave a review for The Falcon and the Stag on Amazon and Goodreads. Also, be sure to subscribe for more books, updates, freebies and news at www.cjrisely.com. There you can also look through blogs or reach out with questions and comments. You can also follow my pages on most media platforms, and I encourage you to join the private Facebook group, World of Alamore, for sneak peeks of works to come. And again, thank you for being the fabulous readers that you are.